Thanks, Topper. A bill that would protect abortion access across the country was reintroduced in Congress today.
The Women's Health Protection Act would ban states from imposing restrictions on abortion that are medically unnecessary or interfere with a woman's access to care.
That means no heartbeat bills, no requirements that clinic doors be a certain width, no waiting periods or unnecessary ultrasounds. It means no abortion bans.
Since 2011, states have enacted over 400 restrictions on abortion. This bill would make a woman's right to a safe abortion and a doctor's right to perform that procedure protected by federal law. Over 200 lawmakers are co-sponsoring the bill. They say in the wake of recent restrictive abortion laws, the time to act is now. And those recent anti-abortion measures passed in states like Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, and Missouri could end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. The laws are part of an effort to overturn the landmark ruling of Roe versus Wade. So let's take a look at exactly what that established and how these laws are challenging it. At its core, the ruling established that a pregnant woman's right to choose is protected under the 14th Amendment's right to privacy. But it also said that right to privacy is not absolute and must be balanced between protecting women's health and protecting prenatal life. To define how we balance those two, the Supreme Court broke it down into trimesters of pregnancy. It established that for the first trimester, the government could not prohibit abortions at all. In the second trimester, the government could require reasonable health regulations in order to have one. And in a woman's third trimester, abortions could be prohibited entirely, except in cases necessary to save a woman's life.